And in this article, they acknowledged this plan, this master plan for global governance, for a global currency, for a global central bank. And there was thanks to the media at that time, I call them the government media, the networks, and then, of course, the major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which basically parrot government policy. And in it, David Rockefeller thanked those for not revealing this because they wouldn't have been able to proceed as far as they had gone had this been exposed to the public. And the point being here, I think, Dennis, is somebody commented to me once that they were on a flight from the West Coast to the East Coast, and they had several stops they had to make in between. And at every airport they stopped, whether it was in Denver, Chicago, and finally New York, they picked up a copy of the newspaper. And the comment to me was, every newspaper I read had the same articles, the same headlines, the same stories. In other words, even though this person had stopped in 4 different cities, the newspapers all looked the same. And isn't this pretty much what has happened today, that basically what the public generally sees in the paper, on the evening news, is a controlled format that is controlled by a handful of companies?
Yeah, and a fellow named Badikian wrote a book about how there's a greater and greater concentration of power into the hands of fewer and fewer people in the media. There used to be hundreds, I don't know about hundreds, but a lot of newspapers in New York City alone, and now there's only a handful. And the idea was J.P. Morgan was working with Cecil Rhodes. I mentioned Rhodes had certain Rhodes Scholars in his secret Society of the Elect, and what they did was they originally thought they would buy up about 300 newspapers. J.P. Morgan did, and there's an entry in 1917 by Oscar Calloway into the Congressional Record where he said what they did was they found out that they controlled 25 of the leading papers because all of the other newspapers fed off of those leading papers for their information, their basic national news stories. And that's why things pretty much look alike. So the press is not only important, or media is not important for what they tell you, but what they keep from you. Let me give one cautionary note, though, to you about that quote you're referring to about Rockefeller thanking people. In my books, what I try to do is actually provide documentation as to who said what where. And so that particular thing I've been reluctant to use because it's supposed to be from some sort of Swiss delegate who was at a meeting, but I've never been able to actually get the tape of that conversation. So I've been reluctant. Now, does that mean he didn't say it? No, it doesn't. And in fact, what I use instead is a book from David Rockefeller's own. It's called Memoirs. It's the title of it. It's his autobiography, published in 2002. And you can get it in any library. If you go to the library, look at page 404 in David Rockefeller's book called Memoirs, and it says, it's a great day at the CFR, so forth and so on. Very next page, he says, some people believe that me and my family are part of a secret cabal conspiring against the best interest of the United States in order to form a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. And then his very next sentence is, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it, end quote. So, yes, David Rockefeller has admitted what they're up to. And it's not just himself. He says part of a secret cabal.
If they are doing this, when you refer to the power elite, and, of course, there's been books written by, you hear things about Skull and Bones, you hear about the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, the Council of Foreign Relations. There's another, I'm trying to think of the society in England, the one
Royal Institute for International Affairs.
Yeah, the one that Cecil Rhodes started. How does one get inducted into these organizations? In other words, how does one become a Bilderberger? And is this the group that you refer to more frequently as the power elite, this group?
Well, one doesn't approach them; they approach you, and what they do. In fact, I think they had their eye on me for a while until they found out I asked too many questions. And I'm not just saying that. I literally corresponded with one of these secret society members of Rhodes' secret society. I didn't even know it at the time. Later on, I found out about it. But what happens is it's multifaceted. You'll have a network of, let's say, the Fabian Socialists, reluctantly, because they're the intellectuals working with Cecil Rhodes' people and his secret society because they were the political and big money people. You'll have the Royal Institute for International Affairs as part of the Rhodes Plan, and the American counterpart or co-part of this would be the Council on Foreign Relations, but that's just in this country. So then you had to go to the Bilderberg, and what you need to understand about the Bilderberg is started by Prince Bernhard, and he was an SS, a Nazi, an SS guy, and he comes out of the House of Orange. Remember I talked about the Netherlands in the 1600s literally putting up the money for the Bank of England? They wanted to get the Stuarts out and William and Mary from the Netherlands in. Okay, that's the House of Orange. That's the one that comes right on up to today. And so the Bilderbergers are coming out of that. You had to have a globalist network. In addition to this elite, you had to have, the business class. So David Rockefeller in 1973 founded the Trilateral Commission, and Barry Goldwater a few years after that said what they want, trilateralists, is economic, political, social, and ecclesiastical control. There's a spiritual element to this, one world religion also. And so these various groups will network, work together, and you mentioned Skull and Bones, and that's for American politics. William Whitney of the very wealthy Whitney family in the late 1800s developed a plan. He had a son who was also Skull and Bones. And what they said is what we'll do is we will contribute heavily to both major political parties, then we'll alternate power so that the dumb public thinks it has a choice, but they don't. And that's why whoever you get in the presidency or in the Senate pretty well has been screened. How do we know this? Well, if you go to Google Books, there's a book called Frenzied Finance, 1904, by a Thomas Lawson. And that's important because he was one of these guys, one of these insiders, one of these paralegal guys, and he got sick of it. He said, I'm not blaming Rockefeller and these people because, if they weren't there, somebody else would be here. It's the system. And in there, he talks about how it's almost a religion. You become part of their network, and he said at 11 o'clock on a certain day, we would make and break empires. This group would make and break empires around the world. This is 1904. And he said, if you're with us, you'll get tons and tons of money. The example he used involved amalgamated copper because that was what he was personally into, but it applied to all this Rockefeller Standard Oil interest and so on. And then he goes on and said, but if you cross these people, there's nowhere in the world that you can get away from them, and they will exact retribution. And then he said, right at the end of the statement, he says, there is a Rockefeller Standard Oil agent in every hamlet, not just every big city, not every town, but every hamlet in the land. 1904, they have their agents all over the place. And what they do is they look for people, young people, and they see, who's maybe going to be working with them. Who can they persuade? Who can they bribe? Who can they give all kinds of advantages? Then they support those people for city council, for state legislature, and eventually Congress. So that by the time you get up to the U.S. Senate and presidency, those people are pretty well bought. Most of the presidents have literally been puppets of these people. In fact, in 1912, they said that. Woodrow Wilson was running for power. Bernard Baruch takes him by the hand, more or less, like a puppy dog, up the steps to meet some of these leading, as FDR called them, financial element that owns the country. They got through talking with him. As he's leaving, they all laugh to themselves and say, let's see how our other candidate is doing. And they bring in Teddy Roosevelt. And the reason is they wanted to split the vote so Taft couldn't be reelected, so Wilson would be elected, so they could get their Federal Reserve and so forth.
It's absolutely amazing because what you just said makes so much sense, because it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat.
Right.
The same agenda is put forward. For example, if we go back to the last decade, beginning with George Bush. George Bush ran on conservative values, hardcore conservative Republican. Then you take a look at George Bush ran up the budget deficits unlike any other president next to Obama. I mean, we went from a surplus to a deficit. He passed another entitlement, the drug prescription program, when the Medicare trustees were basically saying, we're going broke. So, they run under these titles or these platforms, but yet when they get in office, they govern the same.
Yeah, and you mentioned Terrell Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, and he loved these guys, the paralegal, and they actually allowed him because he loved them. He thought the people should be managed by these people. He said that They were needed because the people really couldn't run things by themselves. And so what Quigley said is that what you need to be able to do is alternate power without really changing much of anything. That's what it is, regardless of whether you have a George Bush or a Clinton or Obama. Things pretty much roll along. The deficit goes up and the debt goes up, and they have various tricks. What they would do is, and this would happen down in Texas, but everywhere else, they'll use foundations, maybe public-private partnerships. And so what you'll have is, one of their tricks is, you'll have a foundation, and it will be set up by a major company. And I'm not going to name the name, but I've got specific examples of this. The company sets up a foundation. The foundation goes to a legislature, pays them to enact certain legislation to have, let's say, mental health medication. And what happens is a willing legislator passes this as a great program, and it requires certain mental health processes which require this medication. And the medication just happens to be produced by the corporation that set up the foundation in the first place. They have all these games they play like that.
Dennis, when I look at their master plan in terms of where they want to go, global government, right, global currency, right, a global central bank,
right,
it sounds like to me the resurrection of a 21st century version of feudalism. And what I mean by that, you take a look at, there was just a report released yesterday on government pay in the Obama administration. We have the same thing occurring at the state level where state and federal employees enjoy pay scales equivalent to a lot of corporate executives, pension benefits, health care benefits that are different than the private sector. And you remember when they brought the auto executives before Congress, and they basically vilified them for flying in on their corporate jets, and then Congress turns around and passes a bill to spend almost $500 million to buy corporate jets for Congress people. Nancy Pelosi flies on a 737. Not even Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have a 737. So it seems to me this master plan is almost a 21st century version of reenactment of feudalism.
Yeah, and I've written, in fact, the subtitle of my last book is, I call it Techno-Feudalism, and I put a little graph in the back of it to show the comparison. We're back in 1,000 years ago in feudal times, F-E-U-D-A-L, feudalism. You would have the elite of that day, the princes and the dukes and the earls and so forth, and then you'd have the peasants and the serfs and so forth like that. I put a comparison right down the line on that, and that's the goal. This world socialist government will be a feudalistic government. Then to set the stage of it, of course, you have to have models. And so one reason they used converted Hong Kong was to just, a little experiment as to how that will work. You take a formerly communist country like, China still is, supposedly, and you have a British protectorate in Hong Kong, and then you say, well, we're going to turn over to the Chinese, and it will be a synthesis. It will be a synthesis of sort of Chinese communism and British capitalism, to the extent that British has any capitalism. And so this would be a little teeny model. And then what you do is you go to nations. So what you have is China is becoming feudalistic. They have an elite at the top, and I actually put in one of my articles a picture of a skyscraper in Beijing. It's a beautiful skyscraper, a lot of money paid to the elite there, the high-tech people. But on the front lawn are two women cutting the grass with a pair of scissors. So you deliberately keep this massive number of poorer people so you can compete globally in cheap labor. So they went at the top side by a highly educated population. In China and India, both countries, there's 50 million students, high school students, taking 4 years of algebra, 4 years of geometry, 4 years of trigonometry, 4 years of calculus, 4 years of physics, 4 years of biology, 4 years of chemistry, and statistics thrown in. Plus, they integrate the math each year because that's how you build a building, a little algebra, a little trig, and so forth. Nobody in this country does that. None of the high school students do all of that. And so they have the elite at the top to undercut us in terms of ability, and that's why the auto firm BYD over in China, just after 5 years in auto production, was able to come out with an all-electric vehicle a year before the Volt and at about half the price. And so globally, they will outcompete General Motors in that regard. But at the same time, you deliberately keep in India as well this massive underclass with cheap laborers. An example I used is a friend of mine who had their MBA, went over to China, went into a factory that produced